Good morning, and thank you for joining this webinar of the Wider Europe program of the European Council on Foreign Relations. My name is Marie Dumoulin. I'm the director of the Wider Europe program, and I'm joined by two colleagues from ECFR, Lesia Ogresko, who is a visiting fellow from Ukraine at ECFR, and also a fellow at the Center for Defense Strategies in Kyiv. And Gustav Gressel, Senior Policy Fellow with the CFR, who's been following military developments in the region since 2014. We will be joined in a few minutes by our third speaker, Andrew Wilson, Professor of Ukrainian Studies at University College London and a Senior Policy Fellow with the CFR. We wanted to organize this discussion in light of the double anniversary of Crimea annexation and the actual start of the war in Ukraine back in 2014, and more recently, the anniversary that was commemorated in February of, well, the second anniversary of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. We thought this double anniversary is an opportunity to reflect on the changes Ukraine has been going through over the last 10 years and how these changes have accelerated since the start of the full-scale invasion. Think also of the lessons learned from this period, and the way forward, and how Europe can help Ukraine sustain change and transformation over the next years. We have published recently two research papers, one by Andrew Wilson called Reformation Nation, which looks at domestic developments in Ukraine, and another one by Gustav Gressel, Beyond the War of Attrition, who looks at military developments and how Europeans can best assist Ukraine to face the war. I will give the floor to Gustav to update us on the latest military developments, the lessons learned, and the way forward. But before that, I just wanted to make clear that we will have a Q&A session. And so if you have any questions for our speakers, please write them in the Q&R section of Zoom, and I will try to address most of them with our speakers. So Gustav, can you tell us where things stand and what sense we can make of the latest developments?
Yeah, thanks a lot. So where are we in the war, and what is the prospect for at least this year? I try to cover that. You've mentioned the paper Beyond the Counteroffensive. I have to say the paper basically is from last summer. It was written in September after we did an ECFR study trip into Ukraine. So some of the things that are in the paper have been addressed, others are still outstanding, and I will try to give an update beyond what's in the paper. So the problem is the war is still in an attritional phase. Both parties have difficulties resuming to maneuver warfare. On the Ukrainian side, that is, of course, now extremely difficult because of material shortages as well as shortages in manpower. But on the Russian side, it's equally impossible, and I will later a bit maybe allude to why and how this is playing out. So the war, for the time being, is about attrition. Each party tries to inflict damage to the other side, Ukrainians defending, Russians keeping the pressure up by attacking. And the end result will be who exhausts first. Now, if you look into the statistics of vehicles damaged and killed, Ukrainians actually achieve a pretty good level of attrition, roughly. So, and on average, 4.5 to 1. What does that mean? That for each and every armored fighting vehicle that Russia destroys, the Ukrainian army destroys 4.5 Russian armored vehicles. And that, if you look into kind of textbooks or military textbooks on the sort of ratio of superiority an attacker needs on a defender, and the kind of kills one needs to expect, or the losses one needs to expect if going in the offensive. 4.5 to 1 is actually a good attrition ratio for defending parties. So tactically, with all the problems that exist in the Ukrainian army, it's a mobilized army that's grown very fast. It has grown much larger than its mobilization structures were intended to be in 2022. And these mobilization structures actually came on paper into being in 2021, so they're enormously recent. So given all the problems that Ukraine naturally faces in the state it is still a pretty good attrition ratio. The problem for Ukrainians is that the 4.5 Russian vehicles will be replaced. The one Ukrainians, it is a tricky affair. So let's run into the problematics of resupplying on armored vehicles. For Russia, it produces, if you go into main battle tanks, which are the most widely tracked and sort of highest attention paid armored vehicles we can find on the battlefield, Russia produces roughly between 150 and 200 new T-90M per year. That's not much. That's still considerably more than all of the West produces in main battle tanks. We produce 36 Leopard 2s per year in all of Europe in terms of main battle tanks. And but still, it's too few to cover war losses. But Russia also refurbished roughly between 800 and 1,000 older main battle tanks, that are T-55, T-62, T-72, and T-80s from storages, and pushes them to the front. Also included in Russian statistics as new tanks are roughly between 400 and 500 vehicles that have been damaged at the front lines, mostly by drones, so not fatally damaged, and have been sent back to repairs, have been repaired and resent to the front. On infantry fighting vehicles, Russia produces roughly 300 BMP-3s per year, new, but it renovates roughly 1,000 BMP-1 and BMP-2 that it draws from existing stocks. And the same is true for sort of roughly the same number applies to MTLBs and BTRs, so armored personnel carriers, that are withdrawn from stock and rebuilt and sent into the war. Now that is impressive. The thing is, how long can it last? Russia has withdrawn roughly 4,500 main battle tanks and roughly 4,000 infantry fighting vehicles from existing stockpiles. The still standing remaining vehicles in outside stocks are probably too damaged to be repaired. We also see that they're cannibalized for spare parts. You see that on the satellite imageries, that weapon systems, weapons, guns are missing, that turrets are missing, etc. So they probably will never be repaired to serve as spare part providers. So that would give Russia roughly the opportunity to keep on this war until 2027 to 2028, depending on the losses. However, I have to say that while these numbers are, of course, very high now, the Russian defense industrial complex started with the most easy hulls to repair from. So I think these numbers will probably now start to slow down, because the Russians are getting into the terrain of more difficult and more damaged vehicles that it takes a much longer time to repair. The West already is in that phase, so that partially explains the numbers I will come up next to. Looking on the Ukrainian side, regarding main battle tanks in 2022, Ukraine got roughly 340 main battle tanks from Central and Eastern European allies. These are leftovers of transition to NATO standards, basically T-72 variants. In 2023, Ukraine got 450 main battle tanks, roughly, because Western types have been added to the picture. But the problem is that second-hand Western main battle tank from the Cold War are also now starting to become a scarce commodity, and those who are still around, they are being repaired. And I have on my radar scheduled to be shipped to Ukraine roughly 180 main battle tanks for this year, but then we're gone. And the problem is, how do we sustain Ukraine thereafter? And you can see 180 is considerably less than the roughly 1,200 that the Russians will get this year. On infantry fighting vehicles, Ukraine got 323, also with BMP-1, basically mostly BMP-1, some BMP-2s in 2022. In 2023, adding Western infantry fighting vehicles, Ukraine got 600 vehicles, and that's a really good number, especially as the quality gap is between Soviet and Western type equipment is the largest in infantry fighting vehicles. It's much larger there than in main battle tanks. And that was a quantitative and especially qualitative, a huge improvement. However, for 2024, as the US is the main supplier of these vehicle systems, and given that the US are out, I have 45 infantry fighting vehicles that this year will come from the West. Armored personnel carrier, the situation is always better for Ukraine. In 2022, Ukraine got 1,520. In 2023, 1,898. And for 2024, I have at least 785 in armored personnel carriers scheduled to be delivered into Ukraine. These are mostly MRAP vehicles, so light armored vehicles, either leftovers from the global war on terror, Afghanistan, Iraq operations, or they are newly produced because they're cheap to produce. They're basically armored trucks, so you can crank them out at higher number and at a fast pace. But the problem is that compared even to refurbished BMP-1s on the Russian side, these armored personnel carriers, the MRAPs, are both in terms of protection and in terms of firepower by far inferior to what the Russians have. So you see the problem the West has in sustaining Ukraine in the war. Over the time period, Russia still has material. And the thing is, you probably noticed the ammunition debate. The artillery shell gap is the perfect example for a gap when all equipment that is withdrawn from stock runs out, but you're not yet in the position to produce or to deliver, to sustain Ukraine on newly produced stuff. So in last year, Ukraine shot roughly 2.4 million artillery shells, but a very low number of that was from actual production. The US produced last year roughly 300,000 artillery shells. Europe produced 650,000 artillery shells, but to Ukraine delivered were roughly 300,000 artillery shells. The rest of this impressive number was delivered from stocks. Stocks are empty now. Production is not where we should be. It will, on the European side, be where it should be in the latter half of this year. The US should have produced 600,000 rounds this year. This should have kept Ukraine on the defensive minimum of sort of together EU and US of roughly 5,000 shots per day, which is 1.8 million rounds per year. But the problem is that given the difficulties in the US, they dropped out. They're now being compensated by the Czech Ammunition Initiative, and I hope it will crank out all the numbers that are theoretically possible, because that would supplement the US contingent. But however, the problem is you see the problem that we are not yet there where we should be in terms of industrial production, because European powers and the US thought that the war will end sooner than it is now. And this delay in starting industrial production is causing us a severe trouble. On the Russian side, the Russians produce roughly 2.5 million shells. They import between 1.5 and 2 million shells from North Korea.
It looks like we lost Gustav. or at least that he lost his internet connection. And we still haven't our third speaker, Andrew Wilson. So Lesia, I have no other option than going to you. You've been involved in various capacities with international organizations, with the Ukrainian government, with Ukrainian civil society in all the discussions about reforms since 2014. You've been also, oh, Gustav is back. So let's,
Sorry.
I'll turn to you later. Gustav, if you can take the discussion where you left it.
Okay, basically, I was just saying that the Russian defense industrial apparatus and ammunition, we know, of course, the best numbers. They are already cranked to supply their war effort from what they have. From what they import from North Korea and Iran, they basically scratch together their 5 to 6 million shells that allow them to fire 10,000 rounds a day. That's what they have, and that's why, of course, at a time where Ukraine gets roughly 2,000 rounds a day, sometimes even 1,000 rounds a day in March, February, they of course have a considerable advantage in fires. And the problem is the Russians can sustain this while we still need to crank up our defense industry. Now, you also basically recent news, you saw increased aerial attacks. And if you look into the aerial attacks, Ukrainian air defense shot down the slower part or most of the slower missiles, so the Iranian drones and the conventional cruise missiles, but faster anti-ship missiles, faster air defense missiles adapted to a ground attack role, as well as ballistics and hypersonics that came in were too fast to attack. Why that? Because, of course, Ukraine has very few ground-based air defense systems. They're centered around large cities, predominantly in central and western Ukraine, where you have the resurrected, or Ukraine tries to resurrect its defense industry, leaving cities, especially like Kharkiv and Dnipro, exposed. Soviet air defense missiles are bad at intercepting fast targets, if there are there around at all. Gun-based air defense, which Ukrainians now have plenty of, is very good at catching drones, but everything that flies pretty fast and comes in really steep is impossible to attack. And the Russians are making use of this. And the Russians are importing North Korean and Iranian ballistic missiles to make use of the lack of Patriot missiles to curtail not only Ukraine's energy grid, which they did try to do now, but they're also going after the defense industry because, as I said, the West is insufficiently producing. We are much too late in starting production. We haven't, apart from artillery guns, haven't even made a plan how to produce all the tanks and infantry fighting vehicles. Ukraine needs. Ukrainians do that on their own. They have started an impressive program to re-establish industrial capacity, and that will decide whether the war is won or lost for Ukrainians. The problem is on air defense missiles. These missiles are far too complex to produce them in Ukraine itself. They will and remain dependent on Western supply. The Patriot is a particularly critical system because it's there in larger quantities. It is capable of intercepting ballistics. That makes the whole US drama and saga very important because they are the biggest source of Patriot missiles for the time being. The other thing is, of course, F-16s. Ukraine is a country far too large to cover by ground-based air defense missiles in its entirety. Ukraine needs a fighter force to keep the Russian Air Force at bay. They had, since the Russians started to more aggressively use their glide bombs, which is April last year, and Ukrainian Air Force tried to push the Russians away. You see, well, you don't see because these records are not published, but there is a higher rate of attrition of the Ukrainian fighter force. They are well below the 80 fighters they consider as a minimum to continue their counter-air tasks, defensive counter-air patrols, etc. The problem is that F-16s get delayed and delayed and delayed. We are now in the second half of this year as a scheduled time for delivery. and there are still disputes about the numbers. They probably won't be very large. The problem here also is that given the uncertainties in the US, there are only elderly European F-16s from smaller countries who now, without much of US support, also have difficulties in stemming the logistical and industrial sort of cooperation to really maintain this fleet of F-16s. So yeah, from a European perspective, it might be worth looking into another fighter, because that is a critical capability Ukraine needs to maintain to keep up its effort. Yeah, and this is I know that the paper is a bit bleak, yet I sense that in many European discussions there's like a discussion that the war is already lost. That's not the case. We knew that 2024 will be a difficult year for Ukraine. We knew that last year already. Because of the transition in the West from sustaining Ukraine from stocks to sustaining Ukraine from production. Also because Ukraine has internal issues to address. One is mobilization, that's quite discussed a lot, to increase to again replenish losses, but also to increase the number of units, to rotate units. And if you can rotate units, you can not only grant your soldiers leave, you can also retrain units. And sort of training addresses then issues of cohesion, of different standards of experience amongst especially units that have been clocked together by various sort of rounds of mobilization before. But it also allows Ukraine to incorporate new tactics, new ways of coordinating, especially new capabilities like drone reconnaissance, drone strike, electronic warfare, into your usual way of doing mechanized warfare. And that holds sort of this kind of tactical innovation that holds the key for Ukraine to success, because Ukraine will not win the race for quantity, but it has time and again shown that it can win the race for quality. However, that said, especially from the West, we need to provide Ukraine at least with the minimum quantity to allow the qualitative advantage to play out. If that doesn't come about, then things look dire, but that's up to us.
Thank you very much, Gustav, and I'm sure there will be a few questions to your analysis. I also think that the importance of air defense that you just underlined is something Lesia experiences on a daily basis these days. So as I just started explaining, Lesia, you've been dealing firsthand with all the aspects of change that Ukraine has been going through since 2014. You are now part of the biggest expert coalition thinking about Ukraine reconstruction after the war. Can you maybe walk us through the transformation that Ukraine has been going through, is going through over this period of time, and the way ahead, as you see it from a grassroots perspective?
Thank you, Marie, and good morning, everybody. I would like indeed to approach our Ukraine discussion from, as I call it, an intersectoral lens, and applying optic of understanding the different societal groups inside of Ukraine, their interaction, and most importantly, the trust they enjoy amongst themselves. Because what usually happens when you analyze Ukraine is that, or I would rather rephrase myself, in the very rare instances where Ukraine has been analyzed, because let's be honest, up until 2022, there weren't too many solid Ukraine units or departments in international think tanks or international universities. And if there was an analysis of Ukraine, it was rather conducted through a Russian or an imperialistic lens. And the very few that actually remained were rather looking at Ukraine and analyzing Ukraine from, I would say, institutional perspective, from a viewpoint of formal authorities, representatives of the government, etc., which I think is a quite misleading approach, because you basically apply a logic of mostly Western European countries, to a certain degree countries with an imperial background, and trying to apply it to a post-totalitarian, post-imperial country, missing much of what is going on under the surface of, let's say, politics or government institutions. Not to deviate too much into, theoretical backgrounds, but what is left then in practice is what we have seen altogether in February 2022, when the international intelligence community completely missed the point and delivered erroneous forecasts about how long Ukraine as a country and Ukraine's military would last. You have politicians across the globe and across the whole political spectrum quite surprised that Ukraine's politicians remained in place, that Ukraine's institutions and Ukraine's state continued to operate. In fact, a very large number of Ukraine's civil servants went to work on the 24th of February when rockets were literally falling on our heads. And this is, by the way, a very good illustration of how, from my perspective, overblown the whole corruption debate around Ukraine is, because had the state institutions been indeed so eroded by corruption, then indeed Ukraine wouldn't stand for more than a couple of weeks as projected. And finally, you have citizens and just individuals across the globe who were very much surprised by the emergence of a country, emergence on their mental map, I mean, of a country that apparently has a very strong sense of national identity, moreover are ready to fight for it, moreover are even ready to die for this identity to be sustained in Ukraine. Now, from my perspective, what is really missing, and what I would very much recommend scholars and politicians to look at when to analyze Ukraine, are the two traits that have been there for many decades, and I'm afraid will be accompanying Ukraine for the foreseeable future at least. And the first one is the inherited overwhelming distrust to vertical power structures, i.e. to all authorities, whether it's the national government, local government, to a certain degree, local self-governance. And as a result of it, or rather as a compensation of this huge distrust, you have a tendency of Ukrainians to fall back on people-to-people links. So basically interaction on a very horizontal perspective. And we in Ukraine call ourselves sometimes a horizontal society. When we're talking about these links, it's first and foremost, it's family, it's friends, it's work colleagues, perhaps friends of friends. Now, what is important and what is very interesting from my point of view is that with every new crisis, or I would rather say revolution, I'm talking about the 91 revolution, the early 2000s of the Kuchma era, the 2004 Orange Revolution to 2013-14 Revolution of Dignity, and then the beginning of the war in Donbass, and then 2022 the full-scale invasion. With every, and if Ukrainians are good at one thing, then it's we know how to organize revolutions. But anyway, with every new revolution or crisis, this concept and the actual trust between these people and the circle was very much expanding. So expanded from this inner circle of just family, friends, and colleagues to basically everyone who is around you, to people you would meet on the streets or you would stand with on the Maidan, sharing financial resources, donating money to people you have never met, sharing food, sharing sensitive information, for example. And the speed of the progression of this trust has been very surprisingly high. I'm a fan of the World Values Survey, which is conducted every couple of years from where Yeah, every couple of years. And if you look at the level of trust between Ukrainians, the speed that it is progressing is actually much higher, and leaves, up until now, leaves many EU countries behind, such as France or Italy or Poland, Greece, and other EU member states, which is quite fascinating from my point of view. And with the 2022 invasion, this speed was even is still much higher. Now, the second trait that I think is very important also to look at in Ukraine's perspective is also very much connected to the first one, and is a result of the post-Soviet era, are the very weak institutions. Ukraine didn't inherit a solid and robust policy-making cycle. One of the reasons was, of course, that Moscow was never interested in having strong public administrations in the republics. And basically what happened is you had the policy-making cycle being conducted in Moscow, Moscow analyzing the problems, trying to find solutions. Well, stakeholder consultations, I don't think that ever happened there either. But anyway, ready-made solutions were already transferred to other Soviet republics, and the only thing left that Soviet republics had to do was basically transpose it into national legislation. So basically rewriting the draft law and voting it in the so-called parliaments. This is, of course, a very perverted way of how you engage with public problems and finding policy solutions. But in a way, those two traits, the distrust to vertical powers and the very weak institutions, led to a very interesting phenomenon. And I think this is a phenomenon that is often missed by certain external observers, is that the role of non-state actors has risen dramatically, and the state functions got to be distributed among these non-state actors, which is very untypical and unusual for especially Western European countries, where you have strong institutions being responsible for X, Y, and Z. In Ukraine, it's very horizontally distributed among these non-state actors. And what I mean under non-state actors, it's private sector, business, civil society organizations, the church and churches of Ukraine, media, think tanks, political circles, so you name it. And what you have is an interesting interplay between those non-state actors delivering all types of state functions, such as, for example, lawmaking. You have a very large number of these actors, and not just think tankers. It's sometimes representatives of the business sector or expert communities or whoever, who are being the drafters of different laws, who are being outsourced by Ukraine's government or the parliament. They are also then the ones that are pushing everyone in the political spectrum to vote for these laws, for example. They are then lobbyists and advocates for it. There are a huge number of cases where external actors were basically penetrating the civil service, existing as support offices, reform offices, or whatever you call it, and were responsible for concrete reforms. So reforms were piloted on smaller scales and then upscaled to the dimension of the country. What happened after 2014 with the beginning of the war was that certain security functions have also been born not by the state, which is from a Western point of view, mind-blowing, because this is perhaps the number one state function, is to secure and to provide safety of its citizens. And now with the significant number of charity organizations now, to which millions of Ukrainians are donating hundreds of millions of hryvnias and dollars, we are basically one of the providers of the Ukraine armed forces, and therefore also taking care of our own security as well. Of course, that also expands to the provision of social services. Very often, the public administration is just not having enough capacities, and this is then transferred to other sectors. Now, you can, in the interest of time, you can look at these features as both as a weakness and as a strength. I don't think I need to explain why this can be regarded as a weakness, but from my perspective, in times of war, this decentralized distribution of power can indeed be a very interesting asymmetrical response to a very verticalized Russian society and political system. And this is our response that really provides us with a chance for survival. And this is, from my perspective, the essence of the resistance of the Ukrainian state. I will stop here, but we'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Lesia. And I can now officially announce that we lost our third speaker to technical reasons. Andrew was not able to connect to our discussion. So unfortunately, we will not enjoy his contribution. I invite all listeners to read his fantastic policy brief about domestic developments in Ukraine. But I think we have enough stuff for a good discussion with the two of you. And we already have a couple of questions, mostly on the military side of things. But Lesia, you can also come in and comment on them, because I know these are issues you also follow. So by order of from the micro to the macro questions, to put it that way, to what extent can drones take on tasks otherwise performed by artillery, as some in the Ukrainian military have openly been suggesting, and how long would this work? That was the first question. Since the small F-16 fleet will unlikely significantly change the air defense capability of Ukraine, and since there are no free Patriots or SAMPT, how can Ukraine suppress the threat coming from glide bombs? And then three big questions for the longer term. Can Europe alone, without the US, sustain Ukraine with enough military material in such a way that at least does not allow Russia to win, or even empower Ukraine for a counteroffensive in 2025? What happens if in the West, if Russia achieves a major breakthrough, for example, in Kharkiv or Odessa in May or June? And last but not least, could you spell out the different consequences for European security if Ukraine loses this war? I think we can start with these 5 easy questions. We have some more coming. Yeah, I think we have plenty of stuff with these ones. Gustav, please.
Okay, I will answer the drones and the breakthrough questions in one, because drones are one major reason why a big breakthrough so far hasn't happened. The Russian army managed to breach Ukrainian defenses quite frequently, but never achieved a breakthrough. And that is predominantly due to the use of drones. So when the Russians attack, the usual attack is dismounted. So infantry leaves armored vehicles, attacks on foot. Sometimes they even dig entire trench systems just for the purpose of getting closer to Ukrainian positions and attack them. The armored fighting vehicles provide fire support from a greater distance, where they can be protected by a larger ground-based jammers that prevent Ukrainian drones from getting too close to them. The problem is, once that sort of when they break into Ukrainian positions and then try to accelerate this, use the break in and exploit it into a breakthrough, these armored vehicles usually leave the cover of stationary large power electronic warfare systems and get on the move. Now, they have very small jammers on their rooftops that 1 year ago or like 6 months ago still provided sufficient protection to cut the connection of an FPV drone so that it on the last meters would either crash land or miss the target. But Ukrainians have managed to program their drones in a way that they can, if the connection is jammed, find their targets by themselves. And they even find moving targets and sometimes even sort of targets with camouflage on. So it's quite a sophisticated programming job that they did, but they did it, and it has quite a good effect. And that means that once the Ukrainian drones get close enough to the armored vehicles, they actually at least damage them on the battlefield. And that has made it difficult. And actually, over the last 3 months, despite numerous attempts, impossible for the Russians to break through. They can break in, but not break through. And that makes a very fast and deep maneuver very unlikely. It might still can happen, but it's a quite unlikely event for the foreseeable future. Of course, what might change? Yes, it's always a race between jammers and drones, and the way drones operate, how you coordinate different sorts of drones to actually get strikes successfully through. The Russians won't sit on their butts to just wait. They will try to adapt, and we'll see. But for the time being, this works well. What doesn't not work well is to keep the Russian Air Force out of the skies and prevent them from firing glide bombs. And this will get increasingly tricky. The problem is, because Ukraine is so large and the front is so long, there is hardly a chance to do that only via ground-based air defense. And Ukraine has tried to at least put a higher risk on Russian air operations close to the front by using long-range air defense systems in ambushes and trying to sort of strike out individual aircraft. The problem is here the insufficient cover by normal short-range air defense systems that allow Russia to fly their reconnaissance drones quite deep into the Ukrainian rear, above the altitude, the service selling of air defense guns like Gepard or like Shilka or Tunguska. And the problem is, for all missile-based systems that could shoot down these reconnaissance drones, the stockpiles are extremely low. That in turn means that Russia, time and again, actually intercept such air defense systems. And as Ukraine has very few of them, this is a particularly high risk because you don't get replacements easily. So to my point of view, the only chance is to get fighters. We might have to talk about other fighters. French have offered Mirage 2000. Yes, it's tricky because it's a different strand of ammunition. It's a different strand of aircraft. It's a different engine. It's all, and there are only going to be 30 aircraft roughly because there are few Mirage 2000 operators, and in Europe, France is the only one willing to give one. The other Mirage 2000 operators, I think this is rather unlikely, but still, you know, better than nothing. The Brits are considering elderly Tranche 1 Eurofighters to give away. Now, Eurofighters is also the beauty about Mirage 2000s is it's a very simple aircraft. It operates regularly in Africa from field strips that are challenging logistically, and it manages fine. And that would be an advantage to Ukraine because you don't need a fancy airbase for this thing. You just need a slightly longer, level, straight piece of concrete. Eurofighter is also quite a fancy aircraft. It's difficult to maintain. Gripen, Sweden is now in NATO. This might also be an aircraft. Also, this aircraft is meant to be operated from improvised runways and the Scandinavian forest. So I think that would ease tasks a bit, because also the F-16 is a bit of a sensible aircraft in terms of the environment you launch it from. And then of course the appropriate missiles for these aircraft. But I think there is no substitute for aircraft in this. I mean, looking qualitatively, Ukrainian Air Force has actually done a surprisingly tremendous job keeping the Russian Air Force away for so long with so few and so old aircraft. All the stories I hear in the US media about quality of Ukrainian pilots and all this stuff, I don't believe a word of that. I think this is excuse for political inaction. But yeah, here we are, say Gripen, Mirage, something like that. Will we be able to equip Ukraine for another counteroffensive? If the US stays in the race, this would be well possible for 2025. If the US not, then Europe alone would at least be able to, at least on paper, theoretically, sustain Ukraine on the defensive minimum. However, we need to acquire Patriot missiles for that effort beforehand, and we need delivery contracts for Patriots from the US. It would also be convenient if, for example, there's a discussion in Japan whether the provision of air defense missiles as a kind of defensive weapon should be allowed. That would ease the air defense race considerably. Japan is a producer country of Patriot missiles, and would be a second source for this. So it would be tricky, but it is feasible. I would say some of the recent discussions that hover around behind closed scenes and are pushed into the public with this Macron's statements about troops on the ground, and sort of also a bit sort of behind is a simmering thing in the German Taurus debate, is that Europeans themselves are not really united what to do if Trump wins, and kind of makes sense Richie Grenell to make a deal with Putin over the head of Europeans. And as far as I understand Macron, he's particularly for that occasion wants Europe to be sovereign and tell the US, no, you're not going to make a deal on the fate of a European country without asking us. While another country that doesn't want to supply cruise missiles, their head of government thinks then, well, let's wrap it up and we have done enough, and communication there is going into that direction. So yeah, that will be, of course, politically an interesting thing how it will play out. But in theory, if you look into just production numbers, with the exception of Patriot missiles, where we have to find a substitute, we actually can or could.
We have a lot of new questions here. Lesia, do you want to comment on the first wave of questions, or should we go straight to the second one? There are a lot of questions for you too in the second one.
Yeah, I can quickly comment just on my projections or feeling. I am optimistic about the prospects of US adopting sooner or later the military aid package. The problem is that due to the delay in 6 or 7 months, we Ukrainians have paid an enormous price for this hesitance. But sooner or later, I'm quite sure the US will adopt this package, which basically gives and buys us some time for the European countries and for the EU as a unity to mobilize resources and to basically have a fora up until, I think, second half of 25, beginning of 26. And I do believe that this US bridge can provide this sufficient time for the Europeans to be a little bit faster in delivering these weapon systems, ammunition, and all the other military support. What I do believe is key here is that both the US and the European Union is concentrating on the air defense, because when we're talking about air defense, it's not just in terms of military operations. We're talking about the critical energy infrastructure, the civilian infrastructure, and we have to understand that the center of gravity of this war is also the economic endurance. And this is sort of a very interlinked thing. If Ukraine's economy sustains, we will be able to further sustain our war efforts. If the whole infrastructure is gone, Ukraine alone will have very little resources to be left fighting with. And the second one is the increasing discussion about joint production between Western countries and the Ukrainians, especially on the territory of Ukraine, because it takes so long when you supply it and have to deal with all the logistics. And this is again where air defense goes on the front line, if you wish, and will be able to sustain, to build these factories and then provide the umbrella above our heads. I will stop here. Perhaps we can go to the second round.
Thank you. We have some more minutes and a lot more questions, so I will probably attribute the questions to either of you. Lesia, there are a couple of questions on the Ukrainians' perception of the lack of common goals, war goals in the West, first of all. Also on how Ukrainians would react if Moscow had a political breakthrough in one key Western country, for example, Washington. And I think in terms of political questions, that was it. There is another question regarding the 2025 counteroffensive, and what is realistic throughout 2024. I think this question can go to both of you, whether Ukraine will try to achieve basically defending its territory and sustaining the attrition, or whether it can do more in 2024. And then there are a couple more questions on the military side of things. Again, the question whether Europe would be able to provide Ukraine with the necessary military support in case Trump gets elected, or would Europe have to do more than simply provide material? I think that question is also about recent statements by Macron and others. A question for you, Gustav, on the obstacles to increasing arms production in the West. And I think that's more or less. Oh no, one last question on Russian strategy, whether it's about well, whether that part of the strategy could be to exhaust the Western economy, the Western industrial capacity, and not only fighting on the military side of things. And one last question, last-minute question: what would be required for Putin to resort to a further mobilization, and what impact might this have on public support for the West, for the war, sorry, in Russia, and Russia's ability to keep financing the war? Yeah, a lot of questions again, and we have 3 more minutes, but I think we can go a bit over time, so maybe 3 minutes each. Lesia, shall we start with you?
Yeah, let me try to kick in. As for the question that there is no common vision, and that results in a very big frustration from Ukraine's side, this is very much true. That is felt on both the political level and also the societal one. I think there are 2 parts of this problem. One is indeed this formula that we got stuck with, is that not to let Ukraine lose, but nobody really, or almost nobody really, talks about the actual defeat of Russia. And we all, I think, very well understand that these 2 strategies are very different in a way. And as long as we will be on this track of not letting Ukraine lose, I think we will be falling in the trap of making this war last longer and longer. So I think we, as a collective community of thinkers, let's call ourselves that, have a very important role to play in delivering these messages and pushing the argument that we have to be resolved in defeating Russia, not be afraid in calling it a defeat of Russia. The second problem with this issue is that, from my perspective, Western countries don't have a very solid understanding of internal processes inside of Russia, and don't really have a robust contingency plan or contingency plans in case something would happen in Russia. I think the whole Prigozhin story was a very nice illustration how quickly we can be all collectively taken aback by certain circumstances in Russia that nobody was planning for. And I think here again we are a bit in a trap, like we've been in early 1990-91. The famous chicken speech of Bush, etc., where the West was not really in favor of the USSR breaking up. Here we are looking at not necessarily the same breaking up of a country, although this is what all Ukrainians are very much hoping for, but at least certain unpredictable conditions inside of the Russian society. In terms of the breakthrough, Moscow's breakthrough in Brussels in the West, I think we've arrived finally at the point after 2022 that we are talking about not just a regular armed conflict or certain tensions between different countries or Russia and NATO. We're talking about a shift in paradigm where at least I don't see any way of going back of the so-called formula Wandel durch Handel, of the different diplomatic efforts, trades, etc. with Russia. And I think most of the politicians understand that when we are talking about any type of ceasefire, because I treat the breakthrough as a sort of push for negotiations between the two countries and negotiating a ceasefire. I think it is very important for all of us to understand that this is basically an invitation to continue the war. This will be just a pause for Russia to regain again its military potential. And I think this is very important that we deliver these messages and try to look realistically at the ceasefires, also looking at the lessons learned that we have from 2014 up until 22, how many different negotiations rounds have been, how much violations there was from the Russian side, etc. As for the Ukrainian reaction, I usually look at the sociology, which I must say the Ukrainian authorities are very sensitive about. The Ukrainian Office of the President and the government are closely following sociological studies inside of the country, and it clearly shows more than 70% of Ukrainians are ready to further endure years of war, no matter how long this will take. So I think we have a very strong societal national understanding of what we are ready to fight for, and we have a trapped political leadership that cannot be voted out, that cannot be changed, that is very sensitive to what the population is thinking. So they will not be ready to go for a very radical change of the policy that we have observed so far. Gustav, over to you.
Thanks a lot. So in all briefness, what will Ukraine do in 2024 and when the next counteroffensive will come? Well, 2024 will be a year where Ukraine tries to inflict as much damage to the Russian forces and to inflict as much losses as it can, because that weakens them and prepares the ground for further counteroffensives. But I don't see any major offensive this year. There might be opportunistic attacks, but I don't see Ukraine in the position of doing that for two reasons. First, the issue of manpower, of training. They are all long-term things that you can't correct them in a couple of months. Even if Ukraine, for example, amends now a demobilization law and calls in for another partial mobilization, that would cure a lot of their personal problems. But till you have trained all these people, until you have then fed the people into operational units, and the operational units have absorbed the new trainees and reached a common standard of qualitative quality across units, will basically be at the end of the year. Note that also defensive is much easier, or at least considerably easier than offensive tasks. And especially if you have new units, new recruits, it's easier to train them in their task and job on the defense rather than on the offense. So that supports it. The second thing is defense industrial modernization in Ukraine itself, which is holds quite the key to this, to Ukrainian success. There is a lot ongoing, but most of that, because even in Ukraine, things are cheaper and happen faster than in Western Europe, but they also take time. And note that when defense companies announce that they will produce certain weapon systems, it takes time till they produce certain weapon systems at quantity. Take, for example, the Bogdana self-propelled howitzer. It's roughly the same as the Caesar. It's produced in Ukraine. This howitzer was in the prototype stage and first introduced at the beginning of the war, and Ukraine had few isolated systems. Now they're producing it at quantity, but it took that kind of 1.5 to 2 years to get the production of a system that you had in already developed into full operational production. That takes time. The same applies for a lot of stuff that is now done with the help of the West. It takes time till that is available in quantity, that it makes a difference operationally. And we have to be patient. This is, in German, there's a saying, vom Hudeln kommen die Kinder. This is, if you do things quick, you end up having children's. But it's kind of don't rush things that need their proper time. Obstacles in the West for increasing defense industry is basically long-term orders. Regardless, I mean, there are issues of supply chains, there are issues of shortages of materials, there are a lot of hiccups here and there. They're quite uneven across Europe. Often it's bad management, also that delays things. Bad management not only from company side, but bad management also from the state side, where different agencies procure. You have the defense track for their own armies that is then shipped to Ukraine. You have different assistance tracks, and there is political disunity in where to procure, how to procure. People start to, for the same thing, start to invent different processes, and they all compete with each other. It's a bit of a mess. But the bottom line basically is long-term contracts. Give you again an example on tanks. The maximum production capability of KMW in Munich and producing Leopard 2 tanks is 200 tanks a year. If the company is completely fully booked. The problem is, in order to ramp up and to increase their production, because it's not only KMW that produces the tank, they rely on hundreds of sub-suppliers, small, medium-sized companies that produce individual parts for that. They need first pre-warning time to gear all these companies up to full production, and then to justify the efforts. And it's not enough to just give them subsidies for them, because there are these hundreds of sub-suppliers that also have a financial bookkeeping to keep. To justify that, you need a multiple year of contracts where they produce at 200 tanks a month. So we are actually, in order to make that happen, talking about orders of 800 tanks, roughly. And we're not there. And that applies to, if you talk to infantry fighting vehicles, ground-based air defense, etc., etc., etc. And as long as orders aren't there, things don't happen. Russia's mobilization. Last question. I somehow feel the sense that they are preparing the ground for this. Peskov admitting that Russia is at a state of war is one thing. Russia has relied on money for the most part since their last partial mobilization to create the numbers they need to replenish losses. And on personnel, their losses are far higher than on material. So I said 1 to 4.5 on armored vehicles. On soldiers, it's the attrition rate Ukrainians achieve is considerably higher, 1 to 8 to 1 to 10. Now, the thing is that Russia already doubled the financial bonuses for people mobilized that sort of voluntary turn up to be sent to the front that sign a contract in, I think, beginning of March or end of February. That is a sign that they're looking for more people. There's also competition between the Russian oblasts to recruit the quotas they are prescribed to. So we see that basically those people who, for financial reasons, have signed up or are willing to sign up, those have signed up. And now, of course, there's the pondering how to sustain the war on the Russian side. However, that said, a Russian partial mobilization, which is likely for this year, will under no circumstances create more than 400,000 soldiers, because there's a limited amount of barracks, equipment, and officers to train these people. And yeah, you can let them camp in the woods, but they don't train themselves, and they need equipment to train on, and that is limited. So we are probably gonna talk about something between 200,000 and 300,000 soldiers that probably gonna be mobilized this year instead of the spring draft. That is likely. Will that increase the Russian combat power? Well, it will sustain them. The problem is the Russian combat power, by and large, is limited by equipment. And Russia had the ability since their last partial mobilization to generate the soldiers they need to get behind the equipment they have. One way or the other, by pressure, by using prisoners, by mobilization, by financial bonuses that varied over the time being, but they got the soldiers. But the big thing for them that is really limited and where there's no easy cut around the corner is equipment. The more equipment Ukraine destroys, the better.
Thank you both for your interventions. We now really need to wrap up the discussion, but I'm sure we will come back to all these issues, both in our writings, which I invite our listeners to read, and in future events and discussions. Thank you all for attending this webinar, and we will be back to these issues soon. Have a nice afternoon. Bye.